Picture yourself aboard a 16th century caravel, where every breath drawn could be your last. The creaking wooden vessel beneath your feet carries not just sailors and explorers, but invisible harbingers of death that lurk in every corner. While the mighty ships of the Age of Discovery battled fierce storms and treacherous winds on the surface, a far deadlier war raged within their hulls. A war against microscopic enemies that transformed ambitious expeditions into floating nightmares. In these wooden worlds, death wore many masks. It lingered in the stale air below decks, where dozens of men were cramped together in dark, damp spaces. It festered in the brackish water barrels, where invisible killers multiplied day after day. It thrived in the rotting food supplies, turning simple meals into potential death sentences. The sailors who embarked on these voyages of discovery were not just explorers. They were unwitting participants in a desperate game of survival against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight. The great irony of these maritime ventures was that while captains meticulously charted their courses through treacherous waters and hostile shores, the real threat came from within. As their ships sailed into unknown waters, carrying dreams of glory and riches, invisible armies of bacteria, viruses, and deadly diseases waged their silent war. These microscopic adversaries proved far more lethal than any pirate's sword or nature's storm. They transformed proud caravels into floating coffins where men's bodies would waste away in ways that seemed more curse than illness. The sailors of the 16th century were armed with courage and determination, but these weapons proved useless against their invisible enemies. They had no understanding of germs, no concept of vitamin deficiency, and no defense against the molecular destroyers that turned their epic voyages into journeys of horror. As they sailed further from familiar shores, these brave men found themselves trapped in a desperate battle against adversaries they could neither see nor comprehend. A battle that would claim more lives than all the storms, shipwrecks, and sea battles combined. This is the untold story of the Age of Discovery, not just a tale of bold exploration and conquest, but a haunting chronicle of humanity's vulnerability in the face of nature's smallest warriors. In these wooden vessels, every creaking board, every damp corner, and every stale breath carried the potential for an agonizing death, making each successful voyage not just a triumph of navigation, but a miracle of survival against overwhelming odds. The year was 1520. Every nautical mile crossed was a deadly game of chance, where survival hung by the thinnest of threads. In the vastness of the world's oceans, mighty ships carried not just the dreams of empires, but the seeds of their own destruction. For in this age of maritime glory, the true conquerors of the seas were not the brave men who charted unknown waters, but the invisible armies of microorganisms that turned their vessels into floating tombs. Think of it. While history celebrates the names of great explorers and their remarkable discoveries, a far darker tale unfolded in the depths of their ships. For every celebrated victory, for every new land claimed in the name of kings and queens, hundreds of sailors succumbed to enemies they couldn't even see. Scurvy turned strong men into walking ghosts, their bodies literally falling apart as they sailed. Fevers raged through cramped quarters like wildfire, leaving behind only empty hammocks and hastily whispered prayers. Dysentery transformed proud vessels into floating hospitals, where men died in conditions too horrific to describe in polite company. These microscopic conquerors proved more effective than any naval fleet, more devastating than any storm. They didn't discriminate between captain and cabin boy, between seasoned sailor and green recruit. In their invisible conquest, they rewrote the rules of maritime warfare, turning the Age of Discovery into an age of survival against nature's smallest but most lethal warriors. And now, we invite you to uncover one of the greatest secrets of the modern age. This isn't just another historical tale. This is a journey into the dark reality that textbooks rarely mention. What you're about to discover will forever change how you view the great voyages of discovery. Join the thousands of historical investigators who have already become part of our community at Modern Age Chronicles. Hit that notification bell right now, like this video, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll uncover the hidden truths that shaped our world, one shocking revelation at a time. Don't just learn history, experience the raw, unfiltered reality of humanity's greatest adventures and most terrible trials. Remember, the story you think you know is just the surface. The real truth lies deeper, waiting to be discovered. Are you ready to dive into one of history's most haunting mysteries? The Age of Discovery, spanning the 15th and 16th centuries, paints a deceptive picture in our history books. While we often envision bold explorers triumphantly sailing across vast oceans, planting flags on distant shores, and mapping unknown worlds, the reality was far more grim. These voyages were not merely heroic adventures, but desperate battles for survival, where the greatest enemy wasn't the treacherous seas or hostile natives, but the invisible spectre of disease that haunted every vessel. Consider this stark reality. When Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Dutch ships set sail into the unknown, they weren't just challenging the boundaries of known geography. These wooden vessels became floating petri dishes, perfect breeding grounds for a multitude of deadly ailments. Many expeditions lost entire crews before reaching their intended destinations. The statistics are staggering. Some voyages saw mortality rates exceeding 70% of their original crew, with ships often forced to limp into ports as ghost vessels, manned by skeletal crews of survivors. The maritime technology of the era, while revolutionary for navigation, created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The average caravel or galleon housed dozens, sometimes hundreds of men in cramped quarters below deck. These spaces, perpetually damp from seawater seepage and poor ventilation, became breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses. The lack of basic sanitation, combined with limited understanding of hygiene, turned simple infections into deadly epidemics that could sweep through a crew in days. Food and water storage presented another deadly challenge. Barrels of drinking water would become stagnant and contaminated. Salt-cured meats and hard biscuits, staples of maritime diet, provided minimal nutrition and often harbored dangerous fungi and bacteria. Fresh fruits and vegetables, vital for preventing scurvy, would rot within weeks of departure, leaving crews to subsist on an increasingly dangerous diet that slowly poisoned them from within. The medical knowledge of the time proved woefully inadequate. Ship surgeons, working with theories based on medieval humoral medicine, often prescribed treatments that made conditions worse. Bloodletting weakened already fragile patients, while cures involving mercury or other toxic substances claimed as many lives as the diseases they were meant to treat. These health crises had profound implications for the course of exploration and colonization. Many promising expeditions were forced to turn back, their crews too decimated to continue. Others failed to establish planned colonies because too few survived the journey to build sustainable settlements. The Portuguese route around Africa to India, for instance, became notorious as a sailor's graveyard, with some voyages losing up to 80% of their crew members. This devastating reality shaped the very nature of maritime exploration. Nations began to factor in massive casualty rates when planning expeditions. Ships were deliberately overstaffed at departure, anticipating that disease would claim a significant portion of the crew. The fear of disease influenced route planning, with captains desperate to find shortcuts that would reduce time at sea. This pressing need partly drove the search for the Northwest Passage and other alternative routes to the East Indies. The health crisis aboard these ships didn't just affect the crews, it had lasting implications for global history. When surviving sailors made landfall, they often carried diseases to new shores, inadvertently becoming vectors for some of history's most devastating epidemics. The exchange of diseases between old and new worlds would reshape the demographic makeup of entire continents, making these maritime health crises a crucial, if often overlooked, factor in the shaping of our modern world. Between the pages of maritime history lies a story of extraordinary human endurance, where courage and despair walked hand in hand across wooden decks. The men who sailed these treacherous voyages weren't just explorers. They were unwitting participants in a deadly gamble where survival was the ultimate prize. Ferdinand Magellan stands as perhaps the most poignant example of this brutal reality. His ambitious expedition to circumnavigate the globe began with 270 men aboard 5 ships. The numbers tell a haunting story. By the journey's end, only 30 survivors would return to Spain. Over 90% of his crew perished, most not from the romantic dangers of exploration, but from the gruesome reality of disease and malnutrition. Magellan himself would not live to see the completion of his dream, but the fate of his crew serves as a stark testament to the true cost of maritime exploration. Yet beyond these famous names lie the untold stories of thousands of anonymous sailors who manned these vessels of destiny. These were not wealthy adventurers or noble explorers, but common men, sons, fathers and brothers who left their homes seeking fortune or escape from poverty. Their stories were written not in the grand chronicles of discovery, but in the daily ritual of bodies being committed to the depths. The process was grimly efficient. As disease swept through the ships, the dead were wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, weighted with cannonballs or chain shot, and unceremoniously slid into the waiting sea. The lucky ones received a hasty prayer from the ship's priest. Many simply disappeared beneath the waves, their names recorded only as tally marks in a captain's log. These anonymous sailors faced a particularly cruel fate. While captains and officers enjoyed marginally better conditions with private quarters and superior rations, common sailors were packed into the foredeck, where disease spread like wildfire through their cramped quarters. They slept in shifts on damp planks, their bodies pressed against each other in spaces where a man could barely sit upright. The air they breathed was a toxic mixture of bilge water fumes, rotting food, and the effluvia of sick companions. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical suffering. Sailors watched their companions succumb one by one to mysterious ailments that transformed strong men into wasting shadows. They lived with the constant knowledge that they might be next, that every minor cut or fever could be the beginning of their end. Many documented cases exist of sailors driven to madness by this relentless psychological torture, some choosing to leap overboard rather than face the slow death they witnessed in their companions. What makes their stories particularly poignant is the cruel irony of their situation. These men, who had mastered the art of sailing and navigation, who could read the stars and predict weather patterns, were utterly helpless against the microscopic enemies that invaded their bodies. Their considerable skills and hard-earned experience offered no protection against scurvy's relentless advance or typhus's burning fever. The logs of surviving officers paint a picture of progressive desperation. Initial entries might note 1 or 2 sick men, but as voyages progressed, these notations would become daily litanies of death. 3 men lost to fever, 5 bodies committed to the deep. 7 more showed signs of the disease. These clinical recordings masked the human tragedy unfolding on these ships, where each death meant not just the loss of needed manpower, but the loss of a companion, a friend, a vital part of the ship's community. Yet even in this darkness, the human spirit showed remarkable resilience. Surviving accounts tell of sailors sharing their meager rations with sick companions, of men working double shifts to cover for their ailing shipmates, of small acts of kindness and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These anonymous heroes, whose names are lost to history, embodied both the tragic and triumphant aspects of the age of discovery. their sacrifices laying the foundation for our modern understanding of both maritime travel and human endurance. Step aboard a 16th century sailing vessel, and your senses are immediately assaulted by a nightmarish reality that no historical account can truly capture. The first thing that hits you is the smell, an overwhelming cocktail of horrors that permeates every inch of the ship. Rotting timbers soaked in seawater create a perpetual atmosphere of decay, while the putrid stench of moldy food stores mingles with the acrid odor of human waste and vomit. This isn't just an unpleasant environment, it's a toxic miasma that seeps into clothing, skin, and even the sailors' very souls. Below decks, the air becomes thick enough to chew. The limited ventilation creates a perpetual fog of human breath, sweat, and decay. Moisture drips constantly from the ceiling, not just seawater, but condensation from the breath of dozens of men packed into spaces designed for half their number. This dampness feeds the omnipresent mold that creeps across every surface, turning the wooden walls into breeding grounds for countless fungi and bacteria. The water situation aboard these vessels was particularly dire. Stored in wooden barrels, the drinking water would quickly turn brackish and green with algae. As weeks at sea turned into months, sailors would have to strain their daily water ration through cloths to remove visible contamination, choking down liquid that was more slime than water. The barrels themselves would develop their own ecosystems of bacteria and microorganisms, turning what should have been life-giving water into a potential death sentence. Food storage was equally horrific. The salted meat, a staple of maritime diet, would often turn rancid despite its preservation, developing a greenish-grey film that sailors would cut away before consuming what remained. Ship's biscuits stored in dark holds would become infested with weevils and maggots. Sailors would eat in near darkness, deliberately avoiding looking at their food too closely, a psychological defense mechanism against the reality of what they were consuming. The living spaces defied any modern concept of human habitation. Men were crammed into spaces so tight they could barely turn over while sleeping. These areas, never truly dry, became perfect incubators for disease. Personal hygiene was virtually impossible. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing, and the constant humidity meant nothing ever truly dried. Clothes rotted on bodies, and small wounds would fester in the unsanitary conditions. The rationing system was brutal in its efficiency. Each sailor's daily allowance was carefully measured: a few ounces of wormy biscuit, a small portion of salt meat or fish, and a carefully measured cup of water that was never quite enough to quench thirst. As voyages progressed and supplies dwindled, these rations would be cut further. Men would resort to drinking seawater in desperate moments, despite knowing it would only worsen their suffering. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the claustrophobia, the constant awareness of being trapped in these conditions, surrounded by an endless ocean, created a mental pressure that could drive men to madness. The creaking of timbers, the endless motion of the waves, the groans of sick companions, these sounds would become a maddening symphony that haunted sailors even in their fitful sleep. Incredible, isn't it? But this is just the beginning of our journey into the dark reality of maritime exploration. What theories do you have about how sailors managed to survive these conditions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles. Together, we're uncovering the mysteries that changed the course of history. Remember, every like and subscription helps us bring more of these hidden historical truths to light. Join our community of history enthusiasts and be part of the investigation into humanity's most fascinating and terrifying chapters. What other maritime mysteries would you like us to explore next? In the confined world of wooden ships, death wore many masks, but 3 diseases in particular emerged as the most feared reapers of seafaring souls. These invisible killers transformed strong men into shadows and turned ambitious voyages into floating nightmares. Scurvy, The dreaded plague of the sea was perhaps the most horrific of these maritime killers. Its progression was like something from a horror tale. It began subtly, with fatigue and mysterious bruising that appeared without injury. Then came the true terrors. Sailors would watch in horror as their gums turned black and began to rot, bleeding at the slightest touch. Their teeth, once firmly rooted, would loosen and fall out, sometimes during meals. Old scars, long healed, would mysteriously reopen as if by dark magic, while new wounds refused to heal, turning into festering sores that would not close. The body literally began to fall apart. Joints weakened, bones became brittle, and the slightest bump could cause devastating fractures. In its final stages, victims would experience hallucinations and personality changes, their minds breaking down along with their bodies. All of this horror stemmed from a simple vitamin C deficiency, unknown to medical science at the time. Typhoid fever stalked the ship's holds like a silent predator. Spread through contaminated water and food, it was particularly insidious because a single carrier could infect an entire crew. The disease would announce itself with a relentless fever that rose like the tide, accompanied by splitting headaches and crippling weakness. As it progressed, victims would develop the characteristic rose spots on their chest and abdomen, a deceptively beautiful sign of the horror within. The fever would climb higher and higher, cooking the victim from the inside out, while delirium set in. Many sailors would die in feverish hallucinations, believing themselves to be back home with their families. The mortality rate was staggering. In some cases, up to 60% of those infected would perish, their bodies committed to the deep while still warm. Dysentery earned its grim nickname as the bloody flux through the horrific suffering it inflicted. In the cramped, unsanitary conditions below deck, it spread like wildfire. The disease would begin with severe stomach cramps and diarrhea, quickly escalating to bloody stools as the infection literally tore apart the intestines. Dehydration would set in with frightening speed. Sailors could lose dangerous amounts of body fluid within hours. The constant need to relieve oneself, combined with weakness and the ship's limited facilities, meant that victims often lay in their own filth, leading to further complications. Without modern medical intervention, death often came through severe dehydration or shock. The disease was so common that ships would designate specific areas of the deck for those suffering from it, creating makeshift quarantine zones that became known as death corners. What made these diseases particularly terrifying was their interconnected nature. A sailor weakened by scurvy would be more susceptible to typhoid fever. Someone suffering from typhoid would be more vulnerable to dysentery. The combination of these diseases could sweep through a ship's crew like wildfire, creating a cascade of death that could render a vessel unmanned in a matter of weeks. The psychological impact was perhaps as devastating as the physical symptoms. Sailors would watch their companions succumb to these ailments, knowing they might be next. The sight of strong men reduced to trembling, bleeding wrecks, the sounds of their suffering in the night, and the constant presence of death created a psychological torture that could break even the strongest spirits. Many crews developed superstitions and rituals in desperate attempts to ward off these invisible killers, but against such microscopic enemies, prayers and charms proved useless. These diseases not only killed countless sailors, but shaped the very nature of maritime exploration. Routes were planned around the need to make landfall regularly for fresh supplies. Crews were oversized at departure, anticipating losses. The search for treatments and preventive measures drove medical innovation, though true understanding of these ailments would not come until centuries later. The invisible killers of the sea thus became not just agents of death, but shapers of history, influencing the patterns of exploration, trade, and ultimately global development. The brutal reality of life and death aboard exploration vessels comes to us through a rich tapestry of historical evidence, each source adding its own haunting details to our understanding. The most immediate and visceral accounts come from the ship's logs and personal diaries of navigators, whose ink-stained pages tell stories of mounting desperation and horror. Consider the chilling testimony found in Antonio Pigafetta's journal from Magellan's voyage. As one of the few survivors, his meticulous daily entries chronicle the progressive decimation of the crew. His descriptions are particularly valuable because they capture both the clinical progression of diseases and the human tragedy unfolding before his eyes. "Today we committed 6 more souls to the deep," he writes in one entry. And among them was the carpenter's mate who had been with us since Seville. His gums had turned to black pudding, and he could no longer eat for the pain. Ship doctors' medical logs provide another layer of crucial evidence, though their interpretations of what they witnessed were limited by the medical knowledge of the time. These documents reveal desperate attempts to treat mysterious ailments with the tools at hand. One Spanish ship surgeon from 1564 documented his futile attempts to treat scurvy with mustard poultices and bloodletting, noting with mounting frustration how his patients continued to deteriorate despite his best efforts. These medical logs also include detailed symptom descriptions, crude mortality statistics, and sometimes even primitive attempts at identifying disease patterns. The accounts of survivors, often recorded years after their ordeals, offer particularly poignant insights. These narratives, while sometimes colored by time and trauma, provide intimate details about the daily struggle for survival. One Portuguese sailor's account from 1557 describes how crews would draw lots to determine who would clean the disease-ridden lower decks, knowing it was essentially a death sentence. Another survivor recounts how they resorted to chewing leather from their belts when scurvy made it impossible to eat hard tack. Modern archaeological evidence has provided scientific confirmation of these historical accounts. The analysis of sailors' remains, particularly those found in maritime graves and shipwrecks, tells a story of tremendous physical hardship. Skeletal remains often show clear signs of severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. Bones reveal evidence of scurvy through characteristic lesions and poorly healed fractures. Teeth and jaw structures demonstrate severe periodontal disease, confirming accounts of dental horror described in written records. Particularly revealing are the mass graves discovered near major ports, where archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of the state in which many sailors arrived, if they arrived at all. Analysis of remains from a 16th century sailors' cemetery in Lisbon showed that over 60% of the interred had severe bone abnormalities consistent with multiple nutrient deficiencies. Ships' manifests and company records provide yet another form of documentation. These dry, bureaucratic documents record the human cost of maritime exploration through their matter-of-fact tallies of crew losses. The British East India Company's meticulous records, for instance, show that they routinely expected to lose up to a third of their crew on longer voyages, factoring these deaths into their operating costs, like any other business expense. Letters home, when they survived, offer perhaps the most human perspective on these maritime tragedies. Often written in moments of lucidity during illness or by survivors watching their companions die, these personal communications strip away the heroic veneer of exploration to reveal the raw human experience. One particularly moving letter, found in the archives of Seville, was written by a young sailor to his mother. "If God grants me return to Spain, no gold in the New World would tempt me back to sea, for I have seen hell aboard this ship, and it wears the face of my dying friends. Undo." The reliability of these sources varies, and historians must cross-reference multiple accounts to build accurate pictures of what truly occurred aboard these vessels. Yet taken together, these diverse forms of evidence create a compelling and consistent narrative of the horrific conditions and devastating mortality rates that characterize the Age of Discovery. They serve as silent witnesses to one of history's most tragic ironies, that in the quest to expand human knowledge and connection, countless lives were lost to causes that would have been easily preventable with modern medical understanding. The devastating epidemics that plagued maritime expeditions had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate loss of human life, fundamentally reshaping the course of global exploration, trade, and colonization. The most immediate and dramatic impact was the catastrophic reduction in crew numbers. Ships that set sail with full complements would often find themselves critically undermanned within weeks or months. This decimation of crews created a cascade of operational challenges. Vessels designed to be operated by hundreds of men would struggle along with barely enough sailors to maintain basic functions. Many ships were forced to abandon their missions entirely, while others had to significantly modify their objectives. Historical records show cases of ships arriving at ports with less than 20% of their original crew, some so undermanned they could barely be brought safely to harbour. This persistent threat of crew loss forced a complete rethinking of maritime routes and trading patterns. Rather than taking the most direct path to their destinations, captains began planning their voyages around the need for frequent landfall to replenish supplies and crews. New ports of call emerged specifically to serve as rest and recuperation points, fundamentally altering the geography of global trade. The Portuguese, for example, established a network of supply posts along the African coast, not primarily for trade, but as crucial survival stops for their India-bound fleets. The medical impact was particularly significant. The horrific conditions aboard ships became unwitting laboratories for the development of early epidemiology. Ship surgeons, facing wave after wave of disease outbreaks, began keeping detailed records of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. These observations, while based on flawed medical theories of the time, nevertheless contributed to the gradual accumulation of practical medical knowledge. The discovery that citrus fruits could prevent and cure scurvy, while not fully understood at the time, emerged from these desperate shipboard experiments. Perhaps most profoundly, these epidemics significantly influenced the patterns of European colonization and expansion. The high mortality rates meant that many planned colonies failed before they could be properly established, as ships arrived with too few survivors to create viable settlements. This led to a shift in colonization strategies, with more emphasis placed on establishing sustainable supply lines and medical support infrastructure before attempting major settlements. The economic impact was staggering. Maritime companies began factoring in extraordinary mortality rates as a standard business expense. The cost of crews effectively doubled, as ships needed to depart with twice the necessary manpower to ensure enough survivors would remain to complete the voyage. Insurance rates for maritime ventures skyrocketed, incorporating the near certainty of significant crew losses. Some estimates suggest that crew-related costs could account for up to 50% of a voyage's total expenses, largely due to health-related factors. These health crises also influence shipbuilding and design, as understanding of the relationship between living conditions and disease slowly improved. Ships began to be built with more attention to ventilation and sanitation. Storage areas for food and water were redesigned, and separate sick bays became standard features on larger vessels. The social impact was equally significant. The high mortality rates created a persistent shortage of experienced sailors, forcing maritime powers to develop sophisticated recruitment and training systems. The reputation of long-distance voyages as virtual death sentences made recruitment increasingly difficult, leading to the expansion of press gang systems and the use of convicted criminals as crew members. The psychological impact on maritime culture was lasting. The constant presence of disease and death shaped sailors' superstitions, religions, and rituals. Many maritime traditions and ceremonies that survived into the modern era have their roots in attempts to ward off or cope with the omnipresent threat of disease. Moreover, these epidemics contributed to the development of early international health regulations, as ports began to realize that arriving ships could bring devastating diseases. Quarantine systems and health inspections were developed. These early efforts at maritime disease control laid the groundwork for modern international public health protocols. The legacy of these maritime epidemics continues to influence our understanding of global health challenges. The ships of the Age of Discovery provided early lessons in how diseases spread in confined populations, the importance of nutrition in maintaining health, and the critical role of sanitation in preventing disease outbreaks. Lessons that remain relevant in our modern era of global travel and pandemic threats. The medical understanding during the Age of Discovery reflected a worldview trapped between medieval superstition and the first glimmers of scientific thought. This period's medical paradigms were built upon foundations that seem shockingly primitive to modern observers, yet they represented the cutting edge of human knowledge at the time. The complete ignorance of microbiology fundamentally shaped all medical practices of the era. Doctors and healers, working without any concept of germs or bacteria, attributed diseases to everything from evil spirits to bad air, known as miasma theory. They had no understanding that invisible organisms could cause illness, leading to treatments that often exacerbated rather than cured diseases. When faced with outbreaks aboard ships, medical practitioners would often focus on burning incense or herbs to purify the air, while ignoring the contaminated water and food that were the real sources of infection. Superstition-based treatments dominated maritime medicine. Ship's doctors would commonly prescribe remedies based on astrological alignments, believing that different planets governed different parts of the body. The phase of the moon might determine when bloodletting should occur, while the position of Mars could influence the treatment of wounds. Amulets and talismans were considered legitimate medical tools, often prescribed alongside physical treatments. Some ships carried healing stones that were supposed to cure various ailments when touched to afflicted body parts. The absence of basic hygiene concepts proved particularly deadly in the confined space of sailing vessels. The connection between cleanliness and health remained entirely unknown. Surgeons would move from treating one patient to another without washing their hands, unknowingly spreading infections throughout the ship. The concept that invisible contaminants in water could cause disease was completely foreign. Sailors would drink obviously contaminated water, believing that adding alcohol would make it safe. The idea that food could carry disease was similarly unknown, leading to dangerous storage and handling practices. Medicine of the era relied heavily on the theory of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This ancient system, inherited from Greek and Roman medicine, led to treatments focused on balancing these bodily fluids. Bloodletting was particularly common, with ship surgeons regularly cutting open veins to release excess blood, ironically weakening already sick patients. Purgatives and emetics were standard treatments based on the belief that forcing the body to expel fluids would restore balance. Herbal remedies, while forming the most rational part of period medicine, were limited by preservation problems and storage issues. Ships would depart with stores of medicinal herbs, but these would often spoil or lose potency during long voyages. Many of the most effective traditional remedies couldn't survive the harsh conditions at sea, leaving ship's doctors with an increasingly limited pharmacopoeia as voyages progressed. The role of diet in health was completely misunderstood. While some cultures had developed effective traditional practices, like Asian sailors carrying rice with thiamine-rich rice bran, European medicine had no concept of nutrients or vitamins. When sailors developed scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, doctors would often prescribe treatments that made the condition worse, such as rest in damp quarters or the application of mercury-based medicines. These medical limitations created a perfect storm aboard sailing vessels. The combination of ignorance about disease transmission, reliance on superstition-based treatments, lack of hygiene, and ineffective remedies turned ships into floating incubators of disease. The confined spaces and long durations of voyages only amplified these problems, creating conditions where diseases could spread unchecked while treatment remained woefully inadequate. This medical paradigm wouldn't begin to shift until the late 18th century, meaning that for most of the Age of Discovery, sailors faced these deadly conditions without any real hope of effective treatment. The eventual development of modern medicine would reveal just how many lives were lost to this combination of ignorance and superstition, marking one of history's most tragic examples of how limited knowledge can lead to devastating consequences. Let these staggering statistics sink in. During the Age of Discovery, for every sailor killed in battle or shipwrecks, at least 10 died from disease and malnutrition. While naval warfare and storms certainly claimed their share of lives, the true killer lurked in the very air they breathed and the water they drank. In fact, during the 16th century, disease killed more sailors than all other causes combined, including pirates, storms, and accidents. Consider this chilling fact. When Magellan's expedition began its historic journey, 270 men set sail aboard 5 ships. By the time the single surviving vessel limped back to port, only 18 of the original crew remained alive. That's a staggering 93% mortality rate. Even more shocking, this wasn't an unusual occurrence. Portuguese expeditions to India regularly lost 50 to 70% of their crews, with some voyages recording losses as high as 80% of their original complement. Here's another mind-bending revelation. The average life expectancy of a sailor on long-distance voyages was shorter than that of a frontline soldier in World War I. When a man signed up for a long-distance maritime expedition, he was essentially taking worse survival odds than a soldier charging across no man's land. Ship's logs from the period reveal that on voyages lasting more than 6 months, death rates could climb to 60% in the first year alone. The mathematics of maritime survival was so grim that shipping companies and naval authorities routinely oversupplied crews by 50–100%, knowing that disease would inevitably thin their ranks. Ships would depart with double the necessary crew, not for operational efficiency, but as living insurance against the inevitable losses to disease. Did you know that some of the most famous discoveries in maritime history were made by ships that were virtually floating hospitals? When Vasco da Gama's fleet finally reached India, so many of his crew had died that they could barely manage the sails. The first European circumnavigation of Africa was completed by vessels so devastated by disease that they were essentially ghost ships, crewed by walking corpses who somehow maintained just enough strength to handle the rigging. Perhaps the most ironic fact is that these brutal conditions led to one of medicine's greatest discoveries. The cure for scurvy was finally found because ships had become such perfect laboratories of human suffering that the pattern could no longer be ignored. Every voyage that ended in disaster added another piece to the puzzle that would eventually save millions of lives. What you've just discovered is merely the surface of one of history's most shocking, untold stories. The real history of the Age of Discovery isn't written in the bold lines of maps or the grandiose claims of empire. It's written in the ship's logs, medical records, and haunting personal letters of those who lived and died during humanity's greatest maritime endeavor, ready to dive deeper into these extraordinary tales of survival against impossible odds. Join us at Modern Age Chronicles, where we uncover the raw, unfiltered truth behind history's greatest moments. Hit subscribe now and become part of our growing community of historical truth seekers. Don't forget to ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss our upcoming episodes exploring the dark secrets of maritime history. From the hidden horrors of the spice trade to the untold stories of survival that changed the course of human history, we're just getting started. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of maritime survival would you like us to explore next? Your engagement helps us bring more of these fascinating historical revelations to light. Remember, history isn't just about dates and famous names. It's about real people facing unimaginable challenges. Their stories deserve to be told, and we're here to tell them. Subscribe now and join us on this incredible journey into the past.